So after putting this presentation together, I came to find out that it needs to be broken up into two. I'm hoping not three. So today I'd like to go over more of a high level, kind of quick review on what domain-driven design is, a little bit of the taxonomy that kind of rolls into that. And then the next presentation, I'd like to go over how do we take that and implement it in a .NET Core application, okay? So my agenda, let's go to the next here. Today I want to go over high level. I want to talk a little bit about the domain model versus an anemic model and what the differences are. Go over the domain model taxonomy. Talk about what a data transfer object is and how it differs from a domain object. And then talk, if there's time, talk about layers within DDD and where does validation happen. And then these other items I'll do in the next presentation. We'll talk about commands and events and how those are part of, or can be, part of the domain-driven, the domain model. And then the expectations we have on communicating between boundaries. Some of these things have been touched on a little bit in previous COPs that the development strategy lead has done. We have Mike Shank here who's going to help me keep on track and make sure I say the right things today. And actually a lot of things in here I'm going to be quoting from him. And then at the very end I'd like to do a little exercise on going over how this all could work in a .NET Core application. But again, we'll do that another time. So this is mainly for my team. If anyone's joining that's not part of my team, that's fine. Know that I'm going to be giving the same presentation in the development COP. Preston has asked me to prepare for it. So this is kind of more like a trial run. It's more informal. I want my team to ask questions whenever you want. Do not hold back. And we'll just get to where we get to. Okay. So at a high level, I want to talk about real quick, what is a domain? Mike Shank wrote a really good article called What is a Bounded Context? It's in our Confluence space for the team. If you haven't read that yet, I really want you to read it. And I suggest our PMs read it too, and QA as well, Tyler. But it kind of goes high level, what is a bounded context? And it kind of talks about a few principles that you need to know about. So a domain. A domain refers to the business we're in. It includes knowledge, jargon, rules, regulations, relationships, data, and process, and so forth. That is a direct quote from Mike Shank. Subdomains make up a domain, and they can be one of the three types: a core domain, a supporting domain, or a generic domain. Juan or Monica, I'm curious, and Tyler, do you know the difference between these three? If not, it's okay. But maybe one of you guys can take a stab at it. No? Danielle, do you know the difference between these three? Maybe? Maybe not? Anybody on the phone want to maybe give a stab at it? What a core domain is, supporting domain, generic domain?
I could, but it's your presentation, so I'm just going to let you go ahead and do it.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay. Do I have a diagram? I do. Okay. Here's a good diagram. It's kind of fuzzy, dang it. So think of a core domain as our strategic, as a company, it's our strategic value that we provide that sets us apart from the rest of our competitors. It's something that we should not outsource. It's something that we should handle internally. That is a core domain, okay? Let me go back to the, whoops.
What would you say our core domain is, or is that outside of this meeting?
I think we're still trying to figure that out. Okay. I think we have a good idea of what our core domain is.
I don't want to, just keep going.
So it's associated with our intellectual property, or the intellectual property that we want to excel in the marketplace that differentiates us from other businesses, other companies, maybe even our competition.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Thank you, Cameron. So maybe more of a scientific definition. Let me just read it to you. Strategic advantage and differentiation that we have with our competitors. It's so critical and fundamental to our business that it gives us our competitive advantage. Okay. A supporting domain is necessary, but it's not strategic. Can anybody maybe name a few of those that we have in our company? What is necessary but not strategic? And maybe let me add, it's something that we can outsource.
Pega.
Yeah, we don't need Pega anymore.
Well, I'm saying Pega is the supporting group.
What are some things that we could outsource? Maybe go to a third party.
CRM.
Okay.
I would almost argue almost
Telephony.
Yeah.
Right. FFM. Yeah, we could go to third party for FFM. That is a good point, Monica. But when it comes to FFM, our business wants to be a provider for that. So they're considering that a core domain.
I almost would say the SSC is a core domain, but I'm sure other people would argue against it.
There's definitely logic within it that is unique to our business, and in that regard, yes.
Yeah. So again, on core domains, we want our most experienced people working on them. It should deliver about 20% of the total value of our entire system, but 5% of the code base, and take about 80% of the effort. That's a quote from Jonathan Oliver, who's a big DDD individual in the community. Okay, moving forward. How do you identify a core domain?
Oh.
Let's talk about that.
Sorry.
So identifying a core domain is what makes up the system worth writing. So these are the questions you ask. Why not buy it off the shelf? Why not outsource it? So here's a good little diagram to kind of show how you might separate your different types of domains within your business. Notice that they're listing here what the subdomains are, how they overlap, how they relate to each other, which ones are core, which ones are not. It's important to decide what your boundaries are. And this is a process that the architects have started, I think it was last year, maybe a year before they started this, where they started to perform context mapping. If you're not familiar yet, there's a GitHub repo. I'm going to open it up right now and show you. That is a map of our entire business and how they relate to one another. This is where we want to be. I'm pretty sure it's not where we are right now. Is that right, Mike?
Right.
Okay. This is the first step in identifying those boundaries and coming up with domain models for each one of these boundaries. For the FFM that we're working on, here's our boundary. We're part of the Medicare eligibility boundary, and within that we have four of these types of eligibility solutions. And you notice here that they're listing the product family that owns it, what team owns it, who are the subject matter experts, upstream, downstream dependencies, and there's going to be more added to this in the near future that the architects are working on. But if you drill into the actual bounded context, again, kind of the same thing. We need to upgrade this as a team. It's kind of on us to make sure that this context map specific to our ownership is up to date. You'll see probably some tickets on our board come up in the near future for us to kind of maintain this better, okay? All right, moving forward. Service boundary. It's our job to keep up these ownerships up to date in the context map. So after we've identified these boundaries, we then want to generate a domain model around them. So domains represent the real world. Software at best only models the aspects of the real world. That comes from Mike Shank's article that he wrote. Each bounded context has a domain model. Mike, can a bounded context have more than one domain model, or does a bounded context usually just have one?
Usually it just has one. One of the features of the domain model that hopefully you'll talk about is that it should be cohesive. And so if you discover that you've got two disjoint models, then it's not cohesive, and maybe that's not just one bounded context.
So I actually was not going to cover that, so thank you for bringing that up. So when it becomes not cohesive, that should be an indicator that you need to either split it up or you're representing it wrong. It should bring up questions.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, why are you saying
And I
that?
should emphasize too that like it says up there, it represents the real world, the software models it. In this vocabulary, this domain model is not necessarily one set of classes in one assembly somewhere. This is a higher level concept than the code. You want the code to match this, but this is a higher level concept than the code.
Here I also have a third bullet point. Similar entities can exist in multiple domain models, but can have different shapes. What I mean by that is, here's an example, a picture where you have multiple bounded contexts. Each have their own models, but user is also, you could say, a duplicate in the other bounded context for buyers or for payers or for customers. We will see duplication of a participant as an example in our business, okay? But in each bounded context, they're represented differently and they have different behaviors. We might, in the orders and registration, a buyer, we might not care about their email address. That might be a bad example. But maybe in the other bounded context, we do care about their email address. In each bounded context, you will keep the state for that specific entity, how you see fit. So there will be duplication, but that's okay. Here's another kind of a better example of how you would decompose a traditional data model that we are currently used to more of a domain model where you have a user and it can be defined differently. You see how in the conferences management, they're using different properties than they are in the pricing, but note that the ID is something that you do share between the bounded context, right? There was an ADR that was just created by the household product family team. Andrew Whittakin kind of led it, that the architects fulfilled, and it talks about how we are supposed to share entity IDs between bounded contexts. It's a good article, a good decision record. I recommend you go and read it. We're not going to go over that today, but know that there is a set standard now on how we're supposed to share IDs between different bounded contexts. Okay, so let's talk about what the domain model consists of. Now, again, like what Mike Schenk said, a lot of times your software, your code will not be 100% from what your domain model is, right? Think of the domain model more at a high level, and then how does that trickle down to your code? Okay, so first of all, you guys have heard this, and I've kind of repeated it quite a few times, a ubiquitous language. It's very important that we talk about business things within our domain using the same terms and phrases. We have created as a team, that's not a good link. Where'd my links go? I'll go over that in a second. It's also important though to also define what behaviors are unique to your domain. So statements using ubiquitous language about facts, rules, relationships, and process. So with that, you need to generate a model. Models can be described using diagrams, documentation, or even your source code to explain what the models are. Now for the bounded context that we're in, the FFM bounded context, let me get out of this slide deck real quick. We have a few models that we've defined. The first one is just a glossary, where we've defined our ubiquitous language and what each term means. And you've probably noticed that I've been an advocate of making sure that we're using the same terms in our code as well. It makes it easier in the future for us to be able to bring on a new developer and allow them to pick up, or a QA, allow them to pick up things fairly quickly. We're not using different names in different layers. Another way you can represent it is through UML diagrams. Here's a sequence diagram, of which I think we need to update. It's out of date, but it speaks to how the FFM is supposed to retrieve an application, an eligibility application. You can also represent it in a more formal, let's see, where's that link here? A more formal representation of just class relationships. That's not a good example. Where'd my example go? Oh, I know where it's at. Right. This is the EDE API representation of their model, representing the model of what response we're supposed to get back right here. That one's pretty hefty. Okay, let me start my presentation back up here. Oh, here, I forgot about this slide. Again, this is a trial run. I don't remember all the slides I've done. So here's some more examples of what a domain model might look like. But note, I want to make a note here that some of these might look like a data model, not a domain model. We're going to talk a little bit about what is the difference between the two here in a second. So now I want to go over what the difference is between anemic and a rich domain model. You've probably heard me say anemic a few times as we talk about comparisons between code bases in our organization. So when you first look at a anemic model, anemic code base, you first think, hey, this is the real thing. It's a real rich domain model. It has rich relationships. It's structured correctly. It looks like this. It looks like, you know, I got my relationships, I got my values and attributes. I know what's related there, but there's something that's missing. And what's missing is behavior, business behavior. Okay. Martin Fowler kind of has a good article about the anemic model and how he sees it quite a lot in our industry. It's not a bad thing. As always, each pattern should be used in a certain way at a certain time. For small microservices, anemic model actually might be a better approach when it's not a complicated domain. Utilizing an anemic model is just fine. If you look at some of our repos, a lot of them are doing this, where you have DTOs, for example, data transfer objects, and all they're doing is they're more of a core type of, or a why do I always forget this term? Thank you. CRUD, more of a CRUD type of class structure, right? For those that aren't familiar with that, it's a class that pretty much, well, you know what? Let me just Google it, and I can just read the actual term for you. More of a CRUD operation, but it's a class that has both create, read, update, and delete within it. A POCO class, think of a POCO class more of like a class that just has attributes in it in a way. Yeah, Bateman, you had a question?
No, I'm just counting. I was just, the acronym CRUD stands for wages.
Okay, making sure it stands what I said it stands for.
It stands for.
Yeah, so if you only really require a simple, persistent model, the anemic model is a great fit, right? So let's talk about the FFM bounded context for a second. From your experience so far, maybe Monica, do you feel it's a complicated model or is it very simplistic? It's complicated, right? Yeah. So if you want to tackle complexity in a domain, you want to leverage business rules. You want to structure your code in a way that you can easily change business rules in the future. With a anemic model, it's not like that. It's more of a spaghetti type of code. It's more of a this is how it should be at this moment type of thing. Okay. So if your domain is complex, the anemic model kind of becomes more of an anti-pattern in a way. All right. Oh, one thing I want to mention, I think it was Michael Williams that asked if we should be using AutoMapper. Quite a few articles are out there on how AutoMapper promotes an anemic domain model. And if you want to, if your domain model is more complex and you want to implement more of a domain model over an anemic model, you shouldn't be using AutoMapper. Now it's okay to use AutoMapper like for your tests, or maybe even spinning up DTOs, maybe even. But me personally, I would say for our team, let's try to stay away from AutoMapper because of that reason. Mike, do you have any opinion on that?
I agree with you. Instead, it's handwritten code.
Okay.
It's business specific, right? I think AutoMapper is a decent tool when you've got data that you need to get out of your domain model and transfer it across a boundary. As a result, to make that call or go to the front end of your code or something like that. That might be useful. But the changes that you make to your actual domain objects, you want those to be running through your business. I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
We're going to talk more about that, yeah. But you never want to create your domain entities or value objects using AutoMapper as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, okay. So what is domain logic? We're going to talk about this a little bit. Domain logic, AKA business logic, business rules, domain knowledge, various names that you'll hear, is logic that makes the business critical decisions, okay? Maybe we can throw out some examples with the FFM, Monica.
The screener, I mean, right? Like, is that determining who can go forward, right?
So, okay, yeah, I think that's a great example. Keep in mind, though, however, UI and everything I'm talking about here are a little separated. Think of the UI more of, it's just presenting the outcome of what the domain decides in a way, right? The UI gathers information. It then pushes that information to the domain logic, which then determines what to happen, and then it kind of gives a projection to the UI, all right? So let's talk about the screener. We go through and we ask questions to see if they're eligible or not, or qualified to proceed with an FFM application, right? We would hand those questions to the domain model, or sorry, to the, I want to use the word aggregate root, but I haven't gotten to there yet. So we would hand that to the service that handles our domain logic, okay? And it would determine whether or not that person was eligible. And then it would return that response to the UI to then proceed, okay? So that's one great example. Other types of logic, orchestration, the decisions made by the domain model, and transform them into side effects. So again, speaking more to the UI or to such as the BFF that the FFM UI uses to speak with the FFM service. It can orchestrate things, but ultimately the actual decisions are made by the domain model, are made by that business logic that contains within it, okay? So it's important to separate the domain logic from the other types of logic. Other types of logic. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, question on that, because it sounded like on the previous slide that the business logic should be a separate layer, and it sounds like you're also saying that layer exists right here. I think, yeah, right. The business layer exists within the domain, within that bounded context or domain. Where I'm confused is Mike, Kenny James at one point was working on an eligibility service, and that sounds like a domain model that has, because Brady just gave the example of, well, let's make a query to find out if this person's eligible. If that query goes to a layer within our domain, the FFM domain model, that makes sense. That's consistent with what Brady's explaining. But if it actually goes to another domain service to get that query, that's confusing to me.
Yeah, so if you notice here, I got notes on this stuff. I'm only showing you more of a summarized version of the bullet points. But when I say other logic, domain logic specific to our domain, like the FFM, knowing if someone's eligible, which is a different thing, speaking to the eligibility service that either Team 2 is maintaining, or if we need to get SCP eligibility that the shopping team is doing, That is an external service. It's a downstream resource. It's not part of our domain logic.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
helpful.
Okay. So we treat it as such. It's a different layer that we'll talk about later. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not right now.
Okay. So again, it's important to separate these boundaries between our domain logic and, let's just call them third-party services or third-party things that determine logic as well, okay? It's important to create boundaries, and those boundaries can be physical, they can be maybe namespaces, who knows what, right? But you need to create a boundary so that you maintain the purity of your domain model within your code base.
I'll add one thing to that. The other kinds of logic that this domain logic should be separate from are things that are plumbing code, right? It's, for example, if you were to use AutoMapper, you shouldn't have a reference to it within your domain code. It's outside of that code base, where you have to translate between an HTTP request and a call into your domain model. That's some plumbing code that shouldn't be part of your domain model.
So controllers, in our web API, controllers are not part of the domain model.
Right.
You will get in a DTO, which is your JSON body. You'll parse that into a DTO, which then you will act upon it. You will orchestrate what you need to orchestrate, but you will be calling methods on the domain model. I'm going to call it the aggregate root, but I'll get to that in a little bit, which then act upon that information, right? Okay. So you'll notice a pattern. I don't know why I have those in different colors. I can't remember.
Because 1 and 3 work with external.
Oh, yep, that's why. Okay, thank you. Again, this is a trial run, you guys.
Oh my God.
Trial run. I'm just glad I can see those different colors. I am colorblind for those on the line that didn't know. It's a disability. So first of all, prepare all information needed for a business operation, loading participating entities from the database and retrieving any required data from their external sources. So you'll see patterns here. And again, if you look at the bottom, only number 1 and number 3 involve work from external dependencies. So going back to a controller, you're receiving data from an external source that you need to act upon, okay? You then execute the operation. So number 2 is performed by the domain logic. The operation consists of 1 or more business decisions made by the domain model. Those decisions result in either changing the model state, generating some artifacts, or both, okay? And then after that's done, you apply the results of the operation to the outside world. When I say outside world, it could be many things. It could be another service within your domain. It could be via another maybe RESTful call to another service in another boundary, which actually...
Could it be also the UI? Or
Yes, returning that information to the UI or persisting to the database, like Mike Schenk just mentioned. So when I say outside world, I mean anything that's not specifically pertaining to that microservice or whatever it is that is encapsulating that business logic. So only number 1 and number 3 involve work with external dependencies. And those things, that plumbing, should not be in any way part of your domain model. Don't use the same namespace. Maybe even put it in a separate project within your solution. Do something to create a physical boundary so that developers don't infect. Maybe that's not a good word. They don't. It doesn't bleed over.
Doesn't clog the plumbing.
Now with CRUD applications, you get rid of number 2. In CRUD applications, you do it all in the same place. So in a controller, let's say, you just do everything there, right? And that's okay if your domain is not complicated, right? Because adding DDD to your application does add a level of complexity and a level of discipline, okay? So anemic model is where you eliminate number 2 because there's no decisions to make. All operations can be performed by the application server itself. Okay. So after you've identified your boundary, you've identified your model, you need to work on isolating it. All right. So this is kind of a repeat of what we kind of talked about, but it kind of gives a little bit more visual on it. Here's an example on the right on how you could have a leaking domain model where domain objects reference the external world. So a domain object is represented here as an entity and a value object. So you have a person entity, which has a value object of an address. Well, we'll speak to more on what those are, those different types later. But notice how the person entity, and developers think of like how a class would be represented here. Let's say that you're injecting in a person repository into the person entity class, and then the value object address. You're injecting into that address class an API that gives you the state, let's say, when you provide the zip code. Okay. That is leaking your domain model because you are referencing, or you are manipulating your domain objects via external things. Okay, it's not immutable in a way. So let me read the 3 bullet points here. Domain model isolation brings 2 benefits. It reduces code complexity and enables better testability. An isolated domain model is closed. I need a period there, meaning it doesn't leak. Isolation is only applicable to entities that and value objects. They are the heart of the domain model. So this is kind of what you want to do instead. Here's a different representation where the relationships point upwards and all communications go down. So domain model isolation is like an onion architecture perspective, where the information is instead given to those entities, and they do what they need to with it, instead of them reaching out and getting it themselves.
So Brady, normally in the onion architecture is described with references point inwards. You said relations point upwards.
So maybe I could just need to rephrase
so
that.
I think rephrase that.
Yeah.
So essentially what that meant to say is that all of the code that's living in the core of that diagram, the person address, it can run, it can compile, it can do all of the things it does without needing anything in the outer layers. On the other hand, the outer layers, they need the things on the inner layers. So in this example, the location API has a compile time reference in the code to, say, an address type, an address class. Person repository has a reference in the code to a person class, for example.
How did you phrase that again?
References point inward.
References point inward. Does anybody on the phone have any questions about that, or maybe you can add to that? I know Joe McBride, you're on the line. Do you have any additional insight you'd like to add that I can take as a takeaway?
I don't think so, really.
Okay. Okay, here's another type of diagram that might help you out a little bit, and it kind of shows a little bit of the taxonomy when it comes to this model. Very inward, you have your aggregates, which we'll talk about in a second, value objects, domain events, commands, pure domain services, your core domain. Okay. Outside that, your plumbing. Not really, non-critical, non-core domain stuff. Repositories. So repositories, think of it more like a database or some type of data repository that we need to go and get data from or persist to. Okay. So note again that persisting to a database, retrieving information from a database, is not part of the core domain. Okay. And the non-domain application services, logging, UI, controllers, all the plumbing that goes around that. All right. Here's another onion diagram that kind of shows what this represents. Your UI at the top, application services, your repositories, and then your factories, domain services within that, entities, value objects, domain events, and aggregates. And it doesn't have commands there, but I'm pretty sure most of the industry out there says that commands are part of your domain, your core domain. Is that correct, Mike?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is the entire domain. Or is like this is like
Think of this as your
bounded
entire vertical slice, right?
Okay.
So we own FFM, we own the UI all the way down to the database. But if we want to do true DDD, we need to think of it in this manner and how they communicate with each other. All right. So let's talk about some of these things that are part of the core domain. So let's talk about domain entity. I'm going to kind of talk to classes, C# classes, for maybe the devs best understand this. On the right, you'll see a diagram. This comes from Microsoft's. They have really good documentation out there, more like a case study that they did that talks about how how they take DDD and put it into a microservice CQRS type of model, type of platform. And actually, my follow-up presentation will speak a lot to that, to be honest. So here you can say an order entity has a ID, it has properties, and it has behavior. Remember, if we take out behavior, the entity's behavior, it's no longer a domain object. It's following the anemic model. It's a DTO almost in a way, right? So business logic is very important. So here are the properties of a domain entity. It has an identity, and whenever you compare by the identity. And Mike, you might need to correct me on this, but you don't compare by value in most cases.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You could have a domain entity that has the same values, but it's not the same. It's its own entity. Okay. There's no setters. Again, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say here is like best practice, right?
Okay.
This is what's
The ideal.
ideal. It's going to keep you from making your domain model become leaky or invalid. Okay, so no setters. You should always utilize constructors for setting the state. Okay, and using methods instead of setters. Your naming should be ubiquitous. You should be naming your entities as the same way that RPM speaks to them in the business. In most cases, try to, right? So, for example, we just changed one of our terms from eligibility application to marketplace application, right? And there's a reason for that. We should mimic that in our code so that we're speaking the same language. It's really important. Identify commands. Use them as your public operations and methods, right? Can somebody tell me the difference between commands and events?
Command is saying to do something. An event is just something happened. Act on it if you need to.
Can you say that again, Andrew?
Yeah, so a command is ordering something to be done, so commanding it, whereas the event is just stating something happened. If you want to act on it, then go ahead, but you don't have to.
Perfect. So on the right, look how those methods are written. Are they written as like past tense or present? They're written as a command. Make sure you write your methods as commands, right? Now you can go above and beyond that and actually follow more of a CQRS pattern where you are invoking commands, which then command handlers act upon, which then call on your domain methods. But we're not going to get into that today. Number 5, no persistence logic or reference to the outside world. We kind of talked about earlier on the relationships. Okay, we have a comment. Let me look at that real quick. How do I see that? Why is that not showing up? Whoever wrote the comment, I'm having a hard time bringing it up. Can you just say what you wanted to say? Nobody?
Tyler, can you click on it?
I can't click on it.
No, I joined too late.
You joined too late.
The comment.
Maybe I can click on it here.
It's not there for you.
Not at all. Oh, thanks, Patrick. That was a useless
I
comment.
said that at the beginning of the meeting.
I
Okay.
don't actually see any things in the chat.
Number
You must
6.
have joined after I said it. Sorry, that was from the beginning of the meeting. You're fine.
Okay, no worries. Number 6, avoid utility interfaces. And I'm actually not going to go into detail on that one today, but I will next time. When you're writing your logic within your domain objects, a lot of the best practices also is to think about it of don't ask instead of tell. And here's an example of code. Instead of saying, hey, give me the sex and then comparing it as a mel, instead use more of a higher level type of command. Is it a male? Is it a female? Right? Maybe sex isn't the best thing to use as an example here, but hopefully you can get a kind of an idea of how you should be writing your code. I think another way to put this is more of a declarative way instead of imperative way to write your code. All right. Did I miss anything, Mike, on what a domain entity should be?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Okay. When it comes to sharing domain entities between boundaries, it is okay to share the ID.
Yes.
I'm going to have a follow-up question to you on that one about aggregate roots here in a second. Okay, moving forward, value objects. Value objects are part of a domain model. Eric Evans at the top, he's the one that wrote the blue book. The blue book is the DDD, domain-driven design. The first one, really, right? That kind of spoke to domain-driven design. If you haven't read it, it's a good book. Kind of a big book. It's a good book. He says many objects do not have conceptual identity. These objects describe certain characteristics of a thing. What the H does that mean? Well, pretty much a value object doesn't have an ID. It doesn't need an identifier, okay? An example would be like an address or a phone number or an email. Those things don't require identities. And so you do not give them an identity. So, okay, so let me just go through what they are. It's a full member of the domain model. It has no identity. So you're not going to see any ID property on it. It's immutable, meaning if you want to change it, you got to create a new one, okay? Immutable. Cannot exist without a parent domain entity. So you cannot reference it, you cannot create it, you cannot update it, or should I say create a new one when I say update, without, it has to be done through a domain entity. It cannot be done on its own. So if you think of like the IFP code base, heck, we're creating value objects all over the place. There's not a single method that creates a specific value object. And it becomes a problem. You have 40 different ways of creating that same object and 40 different behaviors of doing it. It is compared by value, not by identity, of course, because you don't have an identity, right? So in most cases, you're going to be implementing a equality comparison in that class, okay? And I can't recall, but there was some guidance from architecture on that, whether or not we create like a value object base abstract class that we inherit from for equality comparisons, or if we just generate a resharper, we just use resharper to generate those equality comparisons.
Yeah, we had a discussion in Slack or
A while ago.
way back in HipChat. I don't know about that. I think we sort of came to the consensus that using code generation templates to implement your equality and hash code is probably a good way to go.
Good way, yeah. I think that's what it is. Where did I leave off? 7. Can, in most cases, does contain a small level of business logic. So value objects can contain business logic. But they're not DTOs, okay? At the very end, value objects are hard to manage in relational databases because one of the rules, one of the things you want to try to do is when you're retrieving data from a database, you should only be retrieving an aggregate root, which I'll talk about here in a second. You should not be retrieving value objects individually because they're part of, think of like the human body, right? You have an arm, you have a leg. Those are value objects. They can't exist on their own, okay? And we don't retrieve those things from a database individually, okay? So one of the reasons why I might be advocating the team that maybe using a relational database might not be the right use case for our bounded context. Perhaps a document database is the route we should go. I'm not saying we don't use relational databases for certain circumstances, but to store our domain model, we might want to think about using a document database instead. Any questions on value objects before I move forward?
Do you know how well a graph database might work in some instances instead of a document one, since SQL 2017 will have that support?
Are you asking, Andrew, if a graph database could be a good replacement for a document database when it comes to storing domain objects?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the nature of the domain model itself as well.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't have much experience with graph databases. Mike, do you have any input on that?
Just that even in a graph database, your nodes, which a value object would probably end up being represented as a node in a graph database, the database itself still has to have some concept of identity for that thing. And so you end up with your value object looking like an entity inside the data store if that thing has to have its own identity. So you can manage it. You can deal with your object relational mismatch or your object graph mismatch. It can be handled. It's just usually more convenient with the document. Now, most domain-driven design projects out in the real world are using relational databases, and they just deal with this problem of storing value objects in their database.
Yeah, which does mean you would have to have an ID on a value object in the database.
It does have to have some kind of a key, a primary key. It could be its values rather than a synthetic key, but it does have to have something.
All right, so then it sounds like with that, then if we're not using a document one, we'd probably want to abstract the ID to the plumbing layer. So that way the domain model doesn't really care about ID at all, but externally we know how to manage that within the plumbing then?
That's exactly right.
All right.
That's a good bullet point. I'm going to actually add that. Thanks, Andrew.
Yep.
What is my time, by the way? Was this meeting an hour? So I have
11 minutes.
I got 10 minutes. Okay, let's talk about aggregate roots. You guys have heard me talk about this a little bit. So the purpose of an aggregate root is to ensure the consistency of an aggregation or an aggregate as a guardian. So I have an example here in a second, a screenshot. So maybe I won't try to make up my own on the fly because I am terrible at making up examples on the fly. But think of an aggregate as just a group of domain entities and value objects that are specific to that. They're similar and they're part of the same behavior. And the only way you can generate them and act upon them is through the root aggregate. The root aggregate stands as the guardian. He is the executor. He is the maintainer, okay? So here's some of the principles of that. One, it should be the only entry point for updates to the aggregate. When I say updates, I also mean like creating new things as well. So when you retrieve information from the database is returning a DTO, but you pass that information that DTO has into the aggregate root, which then will create the domain entities and the value objects, okay? Only make changes, creation, modification, and entities within the aggregate, only be the aggregate case, so I kind of repeated myself there. If you change a child entity or value object independently, so this is a warning, the aggregate root cannot ensure that the aggregate is in a valid state. So again, the aggregate root is in charge of making sure that that aggregate is valid all the time. Okay? The aggregate, and I worded that wrong, the aggregate is how I must always stay, okay, so the aggregate is in charge of always keeping it in a valid state. I gotta fix that slide there. So let's talk about what is the taxonomy around that. So here's an example. We have a buyer aggregate. It's one entity. So an aggregate is pretty much a domain entity. It's like the parent of all the other ones, okay? aggregate root, so it has attributes on it, but then it has methods on it as well. So when I create a buyer, part of creating a buyer is creating an address, an order item. An order can also be an aggregate root. An address is a value object because it doesn't have an identity. And notice there's not an ID property on it. An order item is a child entity. It has an ID on it, and it has specific information. Entities can reference other entities through ID references. Okay, and I think best practice is to not, like, I only want to store the order item in the order aggregate root. I don't want to have the order item, its actual properties and everything, in another aggregate somewhere else. I want to reference that through an ID instead. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Within the aggregate, the entity ID may not be meaningful. You're allowed to reference, say in this example, from the order to the order item. You might not expose the order item ID inside that aggregate. It's important for persistence or whatever, but it might not have to be there. When you make a reference across aggregates, however, the best practice is to only reference the ID. So you may have loaded through your database query your order aggregate, and you might have this whole collection of order, address, and order item objects in memory. But when you're dealing with the order should have some kind of a reference to a buyer, and you see that that's a buyer ID.
Buyer ID.
Right? So the order only references the buyer by its ID. It's not a reference to the buyer object in memory. Does that make sense? But you can also see in that order entity, you have an order items collection. You don't have an order item IDs collection, right? So your aggregate is closely tied together. It's tightly coupled. Those objects all interrelate with each other, and it's the responsibility of the aggregate root entity to maintain that consistency and coherence among that set of objects.
Thank you, Mike. I didn't have that on my board, so I'm going to add it.
So again, just when you're crossing aggregate roots, make your references by the entity ID of the aggregate root.
And that's important too, because again, you only want to modify these child entities and these value objects through its parent aggregate root. And that's a problem we have an IFP. We're modifying the value objects and the domain entities within IFP in many different places. And it's not consistent, and it causes bugs, and it's hard to fix. One of the benefits of going this route. So let me just read the bullet points real quick. Root entities have a global identifier. And there was one place that I read, Mike, that someone advocated that you only share aggregate root identifiers between boundaries, that you don't share child entity IDs between boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's okay. I didn't add that as a bullet point, but it sounds like that might be something we want to consider.
That allows your model much more flexibility to be changed inside any given aggregate.
Okay. So like Andrew, an example for you, maybe your aggregate root is a household, right? And you only share the household ID between boundaries, as an example. But then again, you got persons or household members.
That's a great
Participants, and that's a problem I'm currently trying to figure out is what our aggregate root should be, whether it's a household or participant, and what the best route around that is.
Yeah, what you're going to find is you're going to feel like you have an aggregate that encompasses a set of entities that as you try to model the rest of the interactions with the outside world, with other aggregates in your own domain, you might find some tension that, oh, well, I really need to reference this particular entity, and you might discover through that indeed another entity is its own aggregate. So in Andrew's case, I've already had some discussions with other architects that I expect household and person will both become aggregate roots. What maybe we call it participant, whatever we call it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons for that is the life cycle. An aggregate should share a life cycle. So in other words, an order item can't exist without its order. Now, an order could have no items, but that's just an aggregate that has an empty order items collection. But if the order gets canceled or deleted or whatever, that applies to the order item as well. If the order goes away, the address for its shipment also goes away. In the case of household and person, the household might be destroyed or split without affecting persons. So those are, in my opinion, two separate aggregates because they have different life cycles.
Yep. And as you can see in this diagram, it's okay to do that. And it's okay for an aggregate root to reference another aggregate root.
Yep.
Thank you, Mike. So let me go through these bullet points. So rooted entities have a global entity. Nothing outside the aggregate boundary can hold a reference to anything inside it except to the root entity. We talked about that a little bit. Only aggregate roots can be obtained directly with database queries. Now, I marked that in red because that's a nice, that's where you kind of want to be. If you are retrieving things from the database, not through an aggregate root, that might be another identifier that maybe it should be an aggregate root.
This is where you start to cross over into CQRS questions. So I would qualify that statement. Only aggregate roots can be obtained directly with database queries.
For rights, for
the purposes of handling command.
I think that's okay. Yeah, that is good. Let me add that to it. Because in CQRS, you should be able to query any projection that you want that's best for the UI or whatever. You don't have to follow all these rules.
I should say when you're dealing with commands or handling events or otherwise might want to change the state of the domain.
That's probably the best term, state of your domain. Yeah. Objects within the aggregate can hold references to other aggregate roots. A deletion operation must remove everything within the aggregate boundary all at once. That kind of speaks to what Mike Shake was saying, the life cycle. When a change to any object within the aggregate boundary is committed, all invariants of the whole aggregate must be satisfied. Same thing that Mike was speaking to. Okay, let's talk about, what's my time? You guys okay if I go over 5 minutes? I'm getting head nods. Everybody's saying. Okay. Data transfer objects. We kind of talked about it a little bit, but we need to understand the differences between those and true domain objects. And really, if you've been listening, the main difference is domain objects have logic, whereas DTOs do not. So these objects are intended to carry data between external resources and layers within the application. Layers consist of a database, even layers within your own application, your own solution, right? Between an application layer and a different layer, okay? Between UI, between RESTful calls, between different services, they are the items that transfer your information. You know, the JSON body or a JSON payload with your RESTful calls. A command is considered a DTO in a way, Mike, is it not?
Can be.
It can be, but you need to be careful because there's some caveats to that, and we'll get into that in our second session of this. I'm not going to go over that today. So some items here, only, what am I trying to say on number one? Only entry point for updates to the aggregate. I think here I'm just trying to say that it's the data transfer objects. You use the properties that are on them to fill in the methods that you're calling on the aggregate. Okay. Again, you don't use AutoMapper to transfer a data object into a data entity. Thank you very much, Mike. you're gonna type in manually, like Juan, you were saying, how do we generate a DTO? You're gonna do that transform manually, where you take those properties on that data, on that DTO, and you actually physically map them to the method you're calling on the domain object. 2, they expose fields or properties through getters or setters publicly. They have no business logic, really no logic at all. I think, again, 3 helps you better separate the boundaries, and 4, aggregate boundaries and constraints can be ignored in DTO creation. So everything that's around aggregate boundaries, you don't need to worry about. What I'm saying by that is a DTO can contain anything you want it to contain. It's whatever needs to be in there. Whether it be, it can contain everything that I'm listing here. It can contain, you can name it whatever you want. The properties can be named whatever you want. Whatever best represents the external data that's coming in or that's going out. Okay. Any questions on DTOs? I do talk a little bit about DTO assembly. DTO assembly should not be the responsibility of the DTO itself, a domain entity, nor a repository. Again, you're kind of doing that manually. Using something like Dapper is a great way to rehydrate domain entities from the database. And yeah, if you want to, you can use AutoMapper for converting, like what Mike Shank said earlier, converting DTOs to DTOs, let's say, between boundaries. But again, do not use AutoMapper to generate your domain objects, okay, or anything like it. Number 3, going from a DTO to a domain entity should be done by the root aggregate and its methods. We kind of spoke to that. So here's a quick example of a RESTful call. It's a body's coming in from JSON. It's parsing it into a DTO object, a student personal info. Okay. From there, here it's speaking to command. You were manually generating. This is more of a DTO to a DTO, but then you're calling a handler, and I'm not showing this here, but within the command handler, that is where it's calling the aggregate root method. Okay. The last thing I wanted to mention today, because I'm not going to have time to go into take 2 here. Take 2, I want to go over validation and all this other stuff, but I just wanted to quickly mention the dry principle. It's an article that I posted in the developers room a while ago, where we might, I think sometimes we interpret this principle wrong. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself. And most developers feel that is where you just don't duplicate code. But it's okay to duplicate code. Really, what dry is speaking to is don't duplicate your domain knowledge or your domain logic. Don't confuse adhering dry with getting rid of code repetition. Okay? And that speaks to us duplicating data within bounded context. That's okay. It's okay to duplicate, let's say, generating really an MBI number, let's say. It's okay to duplicate that code if it's in different boundaries, because different boundaries handle it differently. It's okay to duplicate that because we're not duplicating the domain knowledge. Yes, we're duplicating code, but that's okay. It's perfectly fine. Okay, so I'm going to get on the calendar probably here in a couple weeks. We're going to go over these other items. Maybe a teaser for everybody. When it comes to validation, this is a tricky subject. There's a lot of opinions out there where validation should be. Should it be in the domain objects? Should it be in the controllers? Should it be in the command handlers? Overall, these are some of the high levels you need to consider. You should be using multiple step validation. Use field level validation on your DTOs as they come into your controllers. So I would suggest, and we're going to go into this more detail, take advantage of the .NET Core API controller attribute, where it will automatically call the model validation on your DTOs. So it's okay to do that. That's great. That is your first level of defense, right? But when it comes to specific domain-specific logic around validation, that should be in your domain entities. Okay. Keep a separation between the incoming DTOs that carry the command data. Kind of spoke to that. And this is a quote from our very own Mike Shank. Emphasis on moving as much validation as possible into the methods of the domain entities because they are responsible for preventing the entity from ever entering an invalid state. Remember, the job of the aggregate root is to make sure that everything within it is never in an invalid state, which in IFP at least, our objects are always in invalid states, and we're getting logging up the yin-yang about null exceptions and who knows what, right? Remembering that basic data entry validation ends up getting repeated. It's okay to repeat it. And we will repeat validation in the UI. That's just the way it is. So we'll go into more detail about that next time. We'll go about layers within DDD. There's a good way to kind of set up physical boundaries so that you're following the correct principles. You have an application layer, a domain layer, and an infrastructure layer. And we'll speak to those a little bit more, okay? We'll talk a little bit more about commands and events and how and why these are important in the domain model, or I'm sorry, in DDD. And I'll even speak more to why this kind of is like killing two birds with one stone, where within our FFM boundary, we're going to have to keep our data that we have up to date with what's happening in household and what's happening in eligibility and what's happening in quoting and all these other boundaries. How do we do that? Well, we've been told that we have to do that through events that are transmitted over Apache Kafka streaming, or not streaming. What are you calling it, Mike? Apache Kafka streaming. Yeah. Okay. Decent word. Great. And we kind of kill two birds with one stone, where we can use commands and events within our own service to invoke change, but we can use the same commands and events to listen and to act upon things that happen in other boundaries. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll talk about communicating between boundaries, must be done using events, not commands, and Apache Kafka Stream. And we'll talk again about how we can take all this and actually do it in a .NET Core application. And that's it. Thanks everybody for joining. How over did I go? 8 minutes. All right. Any questions? Any questions on the phone? Anything I could improve on? Oh, I did fail to mention that I've been asked by Ryan Howard to present this in the development COP once I have it refined. So if you guys have any feedback on what I could improve on this specific section, please let me know now or email me or whatever. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brady.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Especially on a Friday afternoon. Yeah, let's hear it. You don't want to have it recorded? That's fine.
On this topic, should I stick around or is it?
It's just how do we really need a domain model for the FFM service, because most of the business logic I think is simplified in CMS.
That's a great question.
So when do we actually think of a domain model to create it, to use domain-driven design?
So you're asking, should we stick with the anemic model that we currently have in the FFM service?
Because still we're not sure about the business rules as of now. Once we get an idea of how to apply the FFM service and those calls, then we get an idea of what business rules do we need on our end. But as of now, I think FFM service is handling most of the business rules. All we are doing is sending a request.
You mean the EDE API is handling most of it? Yeah.
So when do we?
I would agree. I would agree that maybe at this point we don't need to worry about it because we kind of don't know yet. Right.
So
We don't really.
When do we actually need, and do we have any other service which is using the domain-driven design as of now?
That I don't know.
Not officially, not
They tried to do it in LAC, didn't they?
Yeah.
And event sourcing and CRS, all of it. Yeah, they tried to do it and it just bombed. Yeah. Andrew, I think, is trying to do it in household learning.
Yeah. Domain model? Yeah. That's what I've been trying to figure out. Just take notes on it and waiting for this for some opinions. Did you go off the domain-driven design fundamentals control site?
some of it came from that.
Okay.
And there's another good one too that I think I'm gonna.
Thanks. I did see parts correlate between those. It's like, all right, this matches what was said there.
I also got
Have to
stuff from
finish
the
going.
Microsoft's proposed case study that they did on CQRS microservices, the Blue Book. But yeah, Monica, we probably want to hold off a little more until we better understand the domain, because we're still kind of new, right? But is it okay to have the skeleton that we can kind of code around?
Yeah, probably. I mean, like you mentioned, if you're building an application that isn't complex, then you might not need domain-driven design, because you've got additional rules to follow when you do domain-driven design, and usually more code to write. There's domain-driven design. So if you can carry that baggage, thinking that this is going to become complex, maybe that's okay. And the tricky bit is figuring out what is complex. Is the code that we need to write really all that complex, or the business rules that we need to enforce all that complex, or are we just shuttling data back and forth between somebody else's API, which is theirs is complex, right?
You could argue that that's what we're doing, right? But then what happens when we need to make sure that when they enter in our UI, when they enter in household information, we need to get that over here. And how do we handle that? Can that still fit in the Munich model? Or do we need to consider commands and events and all that goes with it? We might have to,
Yeah, you'll have built-in spots to publish events. You're using domain design, have built-in spots to handle responding to incoming events. So it's probably a good pattern to use. And then,
but I think you're right. We're probably some not immature. What's the word I'm looking for? Still new in this domain.
Still not sure.
We're still not sure what the domain model is. Yeah.
it's another thing that domain design kind of forces is that if you're going to try to use it, you can't get very far until you really understand the domain.
That's why it usually comes after.
Well, it's supposed to help you get the right requirements, right? So if you attempt to create a domain model and you have trouble doing it, then you go back to the business and say, well, wait a minute, this is incoherent or inconsistent, or there's this missing bit here. We need these questions answered, and you end up developing a much better understanding.
So you're saying this actual tool that helps you come up with the right process.
Yeah, if you can't create a ubiquitous language that makes sense and articulate the rules and requirements using that language,
I like
you're not
that.
going to get very far. But if you can, then you probably understand it pretty well.
If we have multiple services built on the same domain, like in a company, we have multiple services. One follows the domain design, and all the other services should follow the same, or
Not necessarily.
how does it have the same ubiquitous?
Well, the ubiquitous language is most important within a single subdomain, a single context. Like Grady's example.